Howdy, folks, and pull up a chair to the campfire here at Grit and Gunsmoke. The West was built on dreams, many of them dug from the dark heart of the earth. Dreams of gold, of silver, of a better life. But for every dream that glittered, 100 more were buried under rock and greed. Before we descend into one such story, do an old storyteller a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the echo that becomes a roar. Now, listen close. This is the story of Silver Creek and the miner's daughter who refused to let the mountain have the last word. The mountain was a god in Silver Creek, a vast, granite deity that loomed over the small Nevada town, its slopes scarred by the relentless pursuit of wealth. It gave the town its name, its purpose, and its prosperity, blessing it with veins of pure, glittering silver. But it was a greedy, jealous god, and it demanded sacrifices. Marisol Vega knew this better than anyone. She had been born in the shadow of that mountain, the daughter of a barretero, a Mexican miner named Eduardo Vega. Her father was a man who spoke the language of the earth, who could read the stories in the rock, and whose hands, though calloused and scarred, were gentle and kind. He had taught her to see the beauty in the harsh landscape, to respect the power of the mountain, but never to trust the men who sought to conquer it. The men who ran the North Star Mine, a consortium of East Coast investors represented by a cold-eyed man named Mr. Silas Blackwood, did not respect the mountain. They saw it only as a vault to be plundered. They pushed their men too hard, cut corners on safety timbers, and ignored the groans of the stressed rock in their relentless pursuit of profit. The mountain, in turn, would whisper its warnings. Small rockfalls, dust-choked tunnels. But the men in charge were deaf to its language. The day the mountain finally screamed, Marisol was 17. A deep, guttural roar had echoed from the heart of the North Star, a sound that was less a noise and more a physical blow. The number 3 shaft, the one her father was working in, had collapsed. A cave-in. For 2 days, the town held its breath. The women, Marisol among them, gathered at the mine entrance, their faces pale masks of hope and dread. But Silas Blackwood and his hired guns, a grim collection of thugs who served as mine security, refused to mount a proper rescue. Too dangerous, Blackwood had said, his voice devoid of all sympathy. We can't risk more lives for men who are likely already dead. It was a lie. Marisol, who had spent her life around the mine, knew it was a lie. Her father had warned of the instability in that shaft for weeks. A rescue was possible, but it would be expensive. It would halt production. And so, for the price of a few days' profit, 12 men, including Eduardo Vega, were left to die in the suffocating darkness, their final resting place a tomb of greed. The official verdict, delivered by a town marshal whose salary was paid by Blackwood's company, was a tragic accident. The town was offered condolences. The families were offered a pittance. And the mountain fell silent once more. That silence was where Marisol's story truly began. For 10 years, she lived in that silence. Grief was a constant, quiet companion. Fear was the air she breathed. She watched as other accidents occurred. She saw miners, crippled by their work, cast aside with no compensation. She saw the families of those who dared to speak up driven from town by Blackwood's thugs. Silver Creek was not a town, it was a company-owned prison camp, and the mountain was its warden. But under the surface of the quiet, fearful young woman, something else was growing. The gentle girl who had loved her father's stories was being slowly, methodically replaced by a woman with a will of cold, hard granite. She did not seek overt revenge. That was a fool's game, a quick path to a shallow grave. She chose a different path, the path of knowledge. She began to learn. She was no longer just a miner's daughter, she became a student of the mountain and its plunderers. She took odd jobs at the SE office, learning to read the geological surveys, to understand the maps of the tunnels. She observed the engineers, listening to their talk of support structures, of blasting patterns, of the very mechanics of the beast that had swallowed her father. She learned to shoot. The blacksmith, a kind, silent man named Elias who had been her father's friend, saw the fire in her eyes. In secret, in a hidden canyon far from prying eyes, he taught her how to handle a pistol. At first, the Colt was a heavy, alien thing in her hands. But she practiced with a relentless, single-minded focus until the gun became an extension of her will, its report no longer a frightening explosion, but a sharp, clear punctuation mark. And most importantly, she gathered information. She was a ghost in her own town, her quiet demeanor making her invisible. She listened to the whispers in the general store, to the drunken boasts of Blackwood's men in the saloon. She pieced together the entire, rotten network of corruption, which miners were being paid to be informants, which town council members were on Blackwood's payroll, the routes the silver shipments took out of the valley. She was forging an arsenal not of bullets, but of secrets. Her quiet war began with small, anonymous acts of rebellion. She would use her knowledge of the tunnels to leave warnings for the miners, a chalked symbol on a rock wall indicating a dangerously unstable section that the company foremen were ignoring. She would secretly deliver food and medicine, paid for with her own meager wages, to the families of striking miners who had been beaten and blacklisted by Blackwood's men. She was a whisper of hope in the dark, a nameless guardian the miners began to call La Sombre, the Shadow. But she knew it was not enough. To truly bring justice, she had to strike at the heart of the operation. She had to hit Blackwood where it hurt, his river of silver. The opportunity came on a cold, clear night, with a full moon hanging in the sky like a silver dollar. A message from a trusted source, a young boy who worked in the stables, confirmed what her own observations had suggested. A massive, heavily guarded wagon train, carrying a month's worth of refined silver bullion, was scheduled to leave the mine. It would not take the main road. To avoid potential hijackers, it would take a treacherous, little-used path that wound along the banks of Silver Creek itself. The very creek that gave the town its name, the creek that was so often stained with the blood and sweat of the men who toiled in the mountain. It was the perfect place for a reckoning. That night, Marisol did not work alone. She approached the two men in town she knew she could trust. The first was Elias, the blacksmith, a man whose quiet strength was a bedrock of the community's buried conscience. The second was a young, hot-headed miner named Mateo, whose own brother had been crippled in a recent rockfall. She met them in the back of the smithy, the air thick with the smell of coal and iron. In the flickering firelight of the forge, she laid out her plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and likely suicidal. "He will have at least 10 armed guards," Elias said, his voice a low, worried rumble. "We are only 3. We will not fight them with numbers," Marisol replied, her dark eyes reflecting the fire. "We will fight them with the mountain, with the creek. We will use the very land they have been bleeding dry against them." Mateo, his face a mask of youthful rage, needed no convincing. "For my brother," he said, his hand clutching a worn pistol. "I'm in." Elias looked at Marisol, at the quiet, determined woman she had become. He saw the ghost of her father in her eyes, the same unwavering commitment to what was right, no matter the cost. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and then gave a single, firm nod. "For Eduardo," he said. The alliance was forged. A miner's daughter, a blacksmith, and a grieving brother. They were not an army. They were an echo. The echo of all the men the mountain had swallowed, of all the families greed had broken. And tonight, by the banks of Silver Creek, under the cold light of the full moon, they were going to turn that echo into a roar. Marisol Vega was not a general, but she understood the art of war in the way only those who have lost everything can. Her battlefield was not a sprawling plain, but a single, treacherous bend in the creek. Her army was not a cavalry of uniformed men, but a blacksmith, a grieving boy, and the ghosts of a dozen dead miners. And her strategy was born of a deep, intimate knowledge of the enemy's greatest weakness, their arrogance. The night was cold, the moon a polished silver disk that seemed to mock the lesser treasure being hauled from the mountain. In the flickering warmth of Elias's forge, the 3 unlikely conspirators finalized their plan. It was a plan built not on brute force, but on the principles of mining itself. Find the weak point, apply pressure, and let the mountain do the work for you. "Fletcher will be leading the guard," Marisol said, her voice a low, steady presence in the small, tense room. She traced a line in the dust on the floor, mapping the trail. "He's a company man, but he's lazy. He'll have a lead rider, a rear guard, and 8 men flanking the 2 wagons. He'll expect trouble from the high ground, from the cliffs. He won't be expecting it from the road itself." This was the core of her strategy. While a traditional outlaw gang would attack from above, raining down lead, Marisol would attack from below, from the very ground her father had worked. Their first weapon was Elias's masterpiece. For the past day, the blacksmith had worked with a grim, focused fury. The result was not a sword or a gun, but something far more insidious, a dozen heavy iron caltrops. They were not the small things used to stop a horse. These were massive, four-spiked monstrosities, forged from sharpened railroad ties, designed to shatter a wooden wagon wheel and cripple an axle. "We'll place them here," Marisol said, pointing to the narrowest part of the bend, just after a blind curve. "The lead wagon won't see them until it's too late." Their second weapon was Mateo's expertise. His youthful rage was tempered by a miner's practical knowledge of explosives. "The cliff face here," he said, his finger tracing a line on Marisol's map, "is unstable. Mostly shale. A small charge, not enough to kill anyone, but enough to bring down a few tons of rock. It will seal the pass. They won't be able to retreat." The hours before the convoy was due were a testament to their desperate, silent efficiency. Under the cold moonlight, they moved like phantoms. Mateo, with the agility of a mountain goat, scaled the cliff face and planted the small dynamite charge, its long fuse trailing down like a serpent's tail. Below, Elias and Marisol placed the heavy caltrops, hiding them under a thin layer of dust and gravel on the trail. Their final preparation was to choose their own positions. They would not fight together. They would be a triangle of death. Elias, with his heavy buffalo rifle, took a position downstream, covering the convoy's potential advance. Mateo, with his pistol, took a position high on the rocks, overlooking the trap. And Marisol, she chose the most dangerous spot of all. She concealed herself in the rushing, ice-cold water of the creek itself, hidden behind a large cluster of boulders, just yards from where the convoy would be crippled. She would be in the heart of the chaos. She wanted to see Fletcher's face when his world came crashing down. They waited. The silence was absolute, broken only by the murmur of the creek and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They were three small people against a giant of greed and power. It was a fool's errand. But as Marisol crouched in the freezing water, her Colt held above the surface, she felt a profound, chilling calm. She was no longer just her father's grieving daughter. She was his avenging will. The echo was about to find its voice. The first sound was a low rumble, the groan of heavy wagons and the rhythmic plodding of a dozen horses, a sound that was an offense to the sacred silence of the desert night. The silver train was coming. From her hiding place in the creek, Marisol watched the convoy lumber into view. It was just as she had predicted. A single rider out front, a heavy wagon laden with bullion, a second wagon with supplies and more guards, and a rear guard. 10 men in all, plus the 2 drivers. And at the head of the main group, looking comfortable and arrogant in his saddle, was Fletcher. He was a thick-set man with a cruel mouth, the foreman who had declared the rescue of her father too dangerous. The sight of him sent a jolt of pure, cold hatred through her. The lead rider passed the hidden caltrops without noticing them. Then the front wheels of the first wagon hit. The sound was a violent, percussive crack of splintering wood and a screech of tortured iron. The massive wagon lurched violently, its front axle shattering, and tipped over onto its side with a deafening crash. Heavy wooden chests of silver bullion spilled out onto the trail, their contents glittering like evil stars in the moonlight. The convoy was thrown into immediate, panicked chaos. Horses reared, men shouted, and the second wagon slammed to a halt, blocking the trail completely. Before they could recover, a second sound ripped through the night, the deep, booming roar of Mateo's dynamite charge. A section of the cliff face above the trail behind them seemed to dissolve. Tons of rock and dirt cascaded down, sealing the pass. Their escape route was gone. They were trapped. The ambush had been sprung. "It's a trap!" "To the rocks!" Fletcher roared, his voice cutting through the panic. He was a veteran of this kind of violence. He and his men drew their pistols and scrambled for cover, using the overturned wagon as a barricade. The first shot of the battle came from Elias's buffalo rifle. The massive gun boomed, the sound echoing like a cannon in the narrow canyon. A guard who had been running for the rocks was thrown from his feet as if hit by a sledgehammer. One down. Mateo opened fire from his perch on the cliff, his pistol shots providing harassing fire, pinning the rest of the guards down behind the wagon. The night erupted into a storm of lead and noise. Muzzle flashes lit up the canyon in brief, throbbing tableaus of chaos. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the panicked screams of the wounded. Marisol, in the heart of it all, was a creature of the creek. She rose from the water like a river spirit, her cold roaring. She was a target they never anticipated. Her first shot took a guard in the leg as he tried to flank Elias's position. Her second sent another man scrambling for cover. The fight was brutal, a desperate, close-quarters affair. The odds were still not in their favor. A lucky shot from one of the guards struck Mateo in the shoulder, and he cried out, his shots becoming wilder. Elias was a powerful force, but he was slow to reload, and the guards were beginning to zero in on his position. Marisol knew she had to end it. She had to take out the leader. She left the cover of her rocks and began to move, using the rushing water of the creek itself as her shield, the noise of the rapids covering the sound of her movements. Fletcher saw her coming. He roared a challenge and, leaving the relative safety of the wagon, plunged into the creek to meet her, his own pistol blazing. Their duel was the chaotic heart of the battle. It was not a classic, standoffish gunfight. It was a desperate, brutal brawl in the freezing, knee-deep water. They fired at each other from behind boulders, the bullets splashing harmlessly in the rushing current. The fight ended when both their guns clicked empty at the same time. Without hesitation, Fletcher lunged at her, his empty pistol held like a club. He was bigger, stronger, but Marisol was faster, and her rage gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She met his charge, and the two of them went down, grappling in the churning, silver water. He was trying to drown her, his hands clamped around her throat, his face a mask of snarling fury. Her lungs were burning. Black spots danced in her vision. But as her hands scrabbled for purchase on the rocky creek bed, her fingers closed around a heavy, smooth, fist-sized rock. With the last of her strength, she drove the rock into the side of his head. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She struck again, and again. He went limp, his body carried away by the current, his blood a dark stain in the moonlit, silver water. The death of their leader broke the will of the remaining guards. Seeing Fletcher fall, and with bullets still raining down on them from two different directions, they threw down their guns and surrendered. The battle was over. Marisol dragged herself from the creek, bruised, bleeding, and freezing, but alive. She stood in the ringing silence, looking at the carnage, at the wounded Mateo, at the spilled, glittering silver. She had won. But as she looked at the body of her friend, a young miner who had joined them and been killed in the firefight, she knew, with a profound and bitter certainty, the true, terrible price of turning an echo into a roar. The adrenaline of the firefight faded, leaving behind the cold, grim reality of the aftermath. The moon, which had been a silent, silver witness to the battle, now illuminated a scene of quiet devastation. The canyon was filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the moans of the wounded, and the profound, heavy silence of the dead. Marisol's victory felt like a hollow, bitter thing. Mateo was bleeding badly from the bullet wound in his shoulder, his youthful face pale and contorted in pain. Beside him lay the still, silent body of another ally, a young miner named Ricardo who had joined their desperate cause and had paid the ultimate price. They had won the battle, but the cost was etched into the faces of the living and the stillness of the dead. Elias, the blacksmith, was the first to speak, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was heavy with sorrow. "We need to get Mateo to a doctor," he said, already tearing strips from his own shirt to fashion a crude bandage. "And we need to honor the boy." There was no time for proper grief. They were outlaws now, victors in a battle that the world would call a crime. They worked with a grim, efficient purpose. While Elias tended to Mateo's wound, Marisol searched the wagons. The spilled silver, glittering mockingly in the moonlight, held no interest for her. She had not come for wealth. She had come for proof. She found it in the lead wagon, and a heavy, iron-bound chest that had been thrown clear of the wreckage. It was not filled with bullion, but with paper. It was Silas Blackwood's private operational ledger. She lit a lantern, her hands shaking slightly, not from cold, but from a decade of suppressed anticipation. She flipped through the pages. It was a meticulous record of his greed, a catechism of his corruption, bribes to territorial officials, payments to his hired guns. And then she found it. The entry for the week of the number 3 shaft collapse. The words were written in a neat, dispassionate, clerical hand, a script that belied the horror it described. There was no mention of an accident. Instead, there was a cold, brutal calculation. An entry detailing the cost of new support timbers versus the projected loss of production from a work stoppage. It was followed by another entry, an estimate of the compensation payments to be made to the families of the 12 miners. The final line of the entry was a summary of the decision. A sentence that would be forever burned into Marisol's soul, proceeding without reinforcement deemed the most financially prudent course of action. Financially prudent. The death of her father, of 11 other men, their lives, their families, their hopes, all reduced to a line item in a ledger, a simple, cold-blooded business decision. The rage that Marisol had carried for 10 years, the rage she had honed and controlled, threatened to consume her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to burn the world down. But as she looked at the wounded Mateo, at the stoic, grief-stricken face of Elias, she knew that a wild, uncontrolled fire would not be enough. She needed a fire that would not just destroy, but would also illuminate. "This is it," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken sound. She showed the page to Elias. The blacksmith read the words, and the great, silent strength that was the core of his being seemed to crumble. His face, already etched with the lines of a hard life, aged another decade. "Madre de Dios," he breathed. He wrote it down. This was the prize. Not the silver. This single, damning page. This was the truth, bought and paid for with the blood of their friends. They made a grim decision. They could not take all the silver, but they could not leave it for Blackwood to recover. With their remaining strength, they broke open the chests and, one by one, heaved the heavy silver ingots into the deepest part of the creek. The river that had been named for the promise of wealth now became the tomb of that wealth's corrupt legacy. They fashioned a crude travois for Mateo and began the long, slow, mournful journey back to Silver Creek, leaving Ricardo's body under a cairn of stones. A silent sentinel in the canyon of their costly victory. They were no longer just rebels. They were the keepers of a terrible, explosive truth. And they knew, with a grim certainty, that bringing that truth to light would cost them even more. Marisol and Elias returned to Silver Creek not as triumphant heroes, but as phantoms under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness. They moved through the sleeping town, their hearts heavy with grief for their fallen comrade and a burning, urgent sense of purpose. Their destination was the town square, the symbolic heart of the community. It was here that the company posted its notices, where the marshal read his proclamations, where the town's public life, however cowed and controlled, played out. They did not keep the ledger. That was a weapon for a different kind of war. They took only the single, damning page. With a heavy hammer and a railroad spike from Elias's smithy, Marisol nailed the page to the thick, central post of the town's notice board. The sound of the hammer blows echoed in the silent square, each one a nail in the coffin of Blackwood's lies. Then, they performed their final, audacious act. From their saddlebags, they took a single, heavy silver ingot, one of the few they had saved from the creek. They placed it on the ground at the base of the post, directly under the ledger page. It was not a treasure. It was an offering, a symbol of the blood money that had cost the town so much. Then they vanished, melting back into the shadows, leaving their silent, explosive statement to greet the morning sun. The effect was like a slow-burning fuse reaching a powder keg. The first to see it were the early-rising miners on their way to the morning shift. A small group gathered, their whispers a mixture of fear and awe. They saw the silver, a tangible piece of the wealth they bled for but never saw. And they saw the page. One of the few literate miners read the words aloud, his voice trembling at first, then growing stronger with a righteous, furious indignation. Financially prudent. The words spread through the town like a contagion. The crowd in the square grew. The sullen, beaten-down silence that had characterized Silver Creek for a decade was replaced by a low, angry murmur, the sound of a sleeping beast beginning to stir. The fear was still there, a ghost in their eyes, but it was now overshadowed by a raw, collective grief and a burning sense of betrayal. The town marshal, a portly, complacent man named Davis whose loyalty belonged entirely to Blackwood, arrived to disperse the crowd. He blustered and threatened, but his words were hollow. He saw the look in the miner's eyes, a hard, cold fury he had never seen before. He saw the undeniable proof of his master's crime, nailed for all the world to see. He tried to tear the page down, but a dozen miners, their faces grim and set, silently blocked his path. The law, in that moment, became powerless. The echo Marisol had sought to create was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. The ledger page had not just exposed a crime, it had given the town back its memory, its voice, and its soul. The miners, who had been a collection of disparate, frightened individuals, were beginning to see themselves as a unified force, a community bound by a shared, terrible truth. The news reached Silas Blackwood in his office at the North Star Mine not by messenger, but by the sound of the town's own, defiant voice. He looked out his window and saw the crowd, a sea of angry, determined faces. He saw his silver and his secret, displayed for all to see. He knew, in that moment, that he was no longer a king in his castle. He was a tyrant in a fortress under siege. The quiet, grieving miner's daughter had done more than just rob his wagons. She had stolen his most valuable asset, the town's fear. The roar from the town square was a declaration of war, and Silas Blackwood answered in the only language he understood: force. He was a man cornered, his crimes laid bare for all to see. His instinct was not to negotiate or flee, but to crush the rebellion before it could fully ignite. He gathered his remaining hired guns, a corps of about 15 ruthless men still loyal to his money, and retreated to the one place he believed was impregnable, the North Star Mine itself. The mine, once a symbol of the town's oppression, now became his fortress. He and his men barricaded themselves in the main office and the surrounding buildings at the mine entrance. They had the high ground, a clear field of fire, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. From this fortified position, Blackwood issued his ultimatum. The town would disperse, the stolen silver would be returned, and the ringleaders of this insurrection would be handed over for justice. If his demands were not met by sundown, his men would ride into town and burn it to the ground. Starting with the homes of the miners he knew had family. It was a classic tyrant's gambit, turning the town's own families into hostages. He expected the nascent rebellion to crumble in the face of such a brutal threat. But Blackwood had fundamentally misjudged the change that had swept through Silver Creek. He was trying to put out a forest fire with a bucket of water. The fear he had relied on for a decade was gone, burned away by the white-hot rage ignited by the ledger page. The miners did not disperse. Instead, their anger coalesced into a grim, unified purpose. They were no longer a disorganized mob. Under the quiet, emerging leadership of a few veteran miners and the strategic guidance of Elias, they began to organize. They saw Marisol's act not as a call to chaos, but as a call to action. They declared a general strike. The mine, the source of Blackwood's wealth, fell silent, and then they answered his siege with one of their own. They did not try a suicidal, direct assault. They surrounded the mine. They came from their small homes, their faces set like granite, their hearts filled with a cold, righteous fury. They came not with guns, but with their bodies, with their tools, pickaxes, shovels, heavy smithing hammers. They formed a human wall around the base of the mountain, blocking all roads, cutting the North Star off from the town and the outside world. The chapter becomes a tense, slow-burning standoff. It is a battle of wills. Inside the fortress, Blackwood and his men have the superior firepower and position. But they are trapped, their supplies finite. Outside, the miners are exposed and outgunned. But they have the numbers, the moral high ground, and a profound, unshakable solidarity. Marisol is the ghost in the heart of this new army. She does not take overt command. She moves among the miners, a quiet, respected presence. She is their strategist, their symbol. She uses her knowledge of the terrain to direct the placement of their barricades. She organizes scouting parties to watch for any potential reinforcements Blackwood might have called. The days turn into a tense war of attrition. There are small, sharp skirmishes. A sniper from the mine office wounds one of the striking miners. In retaliation, a group of miners, under the cover of darkness, manages to sabotage the mine's main water line, a small but significant blow to the besieged gunmen. The emotional core of the chapter is Marisol's internal struggle. She has ignited this fire, and now she feels the immense weight of the lives that are at stake. She sees the fear and the hope in the eyes of the miners' wives and children. She grapples with the responsibility of her leadership. This is no longer just a personal quest for vengeance. It is a fight for the future of an entire community. She has moved from Avenger to Reluctant General, and the weight of her new role is heavier than any chest of silver. The siege of the North Star is a stalemate, and she knows that a stalemate, for the striking miners, is a slow death. She needs a new plan, a way to break the deadlock without sacrificing the people who have put their faith in her. The stalemate at the North Star mine stretched into its fourth day. The air was thick with tension, a fragile truce held together by the threat of mutual annihilation. Blackwood's men were running low on fresh water and food, their morale fraying in the face of the silent and moving wall of miners. But the miners were also suffering. Their strike funds were non-existent, and their families in town were beginning to go hungry. Time was not on their side. A direct assault on the fortified mine office was still suicide. Marisol knew they needed a different kind of weapon. Not a gun, but an idea. Her mind turned from the tactics of a gunfighter to the knowledge of a miner's daughter. She thought of the mountain not as a battlefield, but as a machine. A complex, interconnected system of rock, water, and engineering. And every machine, she knew, had a critical, vulnerable component. She found her answer in a quiet, tense conversation with a man named Thomas Finch, the mine's chief engineer. Finch was a quiet, bookish man from back east, a man of science and logic who had long been disgusted by Blackwood's callous disregard for safety. His own geological warnings about the instability of the number 3 shaft had been ignored, a fact that had haunted him for a decade. He had remained silent out of fear, but the town's uprising, and Marisol's courage, had finally given him a voice. He sought her out at the miners' encampment, a roll of blueprints tucked under his arm. "He won't listen to reason," Finch said, his voice a low, nervous tremor. "And you can't beat him with force. But you can deconstruct his fortress from the inside out." He unrolled a large blueprint on a makeshift table. It was a detailed schematic of the mine's industrial water pumping system. "This is the mine's circulatory system," he explained, his finger tracing a complex network of pipes and tunnels. "The North Star is a wet mine. Without these pumps working constantly, the lower levels would flood in a matter of hours. They are powered by a steam engine housed in a separate station. Here," he pointed to a small building on the far side of the mine complex, away from the main office, connected by a series of maintenance tunnels. A daring, audacious plan began to form in Marisol's mind. It was a gambit of incredible risk, the true engineer's solution to a gunfighter's problem. "Can you reverse the flow?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the blueprints. Finch looked at her, a slow, dawning understanding in his eyes. He saw the sheer, brilliant audacity of her thinking. "Reverse them," he breathed. "Good heavens. Theoretically, yes. It would require manually resetting the main intake valves and overriding the steam governor. It would be catastrophic. The pumps are powerful enough to divert a significant portion of the creek itself." "Then that's our plan," Marisol said, her voice filled with a cold, hard certainty. "We're not going to attack his office. We're going to drown it." The chapter becomes a tense, high-stakes sabotage mission. Marisol handpicks a small, trusted team: Elias, for his strength and steady nerve; Mateo, his arm in a sling but his spirit unbroken, for his knowledge of the secondary tunnels; and Finch, the nervous but determined engineer, for his technical expertise. They would not go over the mountain, but through it, using a series of old, forgotten prospectors' tunnels that were not on any of Blackwood's official maps. They began their infiltration. The journey through the dark, claustrophobic passages is a suspenseful sequence. They are a ghost army, moving through the very heart of the enemy's stronghold, unseen and unheard. They reach the pumping station, a noisy, hellish cavern of hissing steam and grinding gears, manned by only 2 of Blackwood's guards. The takedown is silent and efficient, a testament to the skills Marisol's small band of rebels has acquired. Now comes the most dangerous part. With Elias and Mateo standing guard, Finch and Marisol begin their race against time. The noise of the machinery provides cover, but the risk of discovery is immense. The scene is a tense, detailed sequence of industrial sabotage. Finch, his hands surprisingly steady, calls out instructions as he and Marisol work with wrenches and pry bars, turning massive, rusted valves, rerouting pipes, and tampering with the complex mechanics of the steam engine. Finally, their work is done. Finch makes one last adjustment, pulling a heavy iron lever. The deep, rhythmic chugging of the pumps changes its pitch, becoming a higher, more strained groan. The machine is now fighting against its own design. They retreat back into the tunnels, their mission accomplished. They have not fired a single shot into the main camp, but they have just unleashed a torrent of justice that no walls can stop and no guns can fight. The effects of the sabotage were not immediate, but they were inexorable. Deep in the heart of the North Star mine, the reverse pumps, now groaning under the strain, began their natural work. Instead of pulling water out of the lower shafts, they began to draw a powerful churning torrent in from the nearby Silver Creek. Inside the besieged mine office, Silas Blackwood was initially unaware of the new, more insidious attack. He was focused on the silent and moving line of miners, his frustration mounting. But then, the first signs of trouble began. A foreman from the lower levels, where Blackwood's personal vault and detailed records were kept, ran in, his face pale with panic. "Sir," he stammered, "the number 7 shaft. There's water coming in. A lot of it." Blackwood dismissed it as a minor leak, a consequence of the pumps being neglected during the strike. But within the hour, the leak had become a flood. Water, cold and muddy, began to pour into the lowest levels of the mine, the place where he kept his true wealth and his darkest secrets. The mountain, the source of his power, was now actively trying to drown him in it. Panic erupted among his hired guns. They were fighters, not miners. The thought of being trapped underground in a flood was a primal terror that no amount of money could soothe. The siege they had been so confident of winning was now irrelevant. Their fortress was becoming a watery tomb. From a safe vantage point, Marisol, Elias, Finch, and Mateo watched the chaos unfold. They saw the frantic, panicked movements of the guards. They heard the distant, muffled shouts from deep within the mine. "It's working," Finch breathed, a look of awe and terror on his face. "The entire lower gallery will be submerged within 3 hours." The flood was a perfect weapon. It was not just a physical attack, it was a psychological one. It attacked Blackwood's wealth, his power, and the very foundation of his fortress. He was faced with a stark, impossible choice: stay and watch his entire enterprise be washed away in a torrent of mud and rock, or surrender to the very people he had terrorized. The torrent of water was a physical manifestation of the justice he had long denied. It was the mountain itself, aided by the daughter of a man it had swallowed, finally passing its judgment. The battle of wills was no longer between Blackwood and the miners. It was between Blackwood and the earth. And the earth was winning. The flood broke Silas Blackwood's will. The specter of drowning in the dark, suffocating tunnels of his own mind was a fate more terrifying than any gunfight. His authority, already shattered, dissolved completely as his men, their loyalty washed away by the rising water, began to throw down their weapons, desperate to escape the collapsing mine. Finally, a crude white flag, a dirty shirt tied to a rifle, appeared at the main entrance of the mine office. Blackwood and his remaining, terrified men were forced out, not by a hail of bullets, but by the relentless, gurgling sound of the rising floodwaters. They emerged into the sunlight, defeated and soaked, to face the silent, assembled crowd of striking miners. There was no celebratory cheer. There was no triumphant roar. There was only a profound, heavy silence as the townspeople stared at their former oppressor, now a broken, powerless man. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard, and righteous gravity. Marisol ensured there would be no mob justice. She stepped forward, not as an executioner, but as the town's undisputed moral authority. "He will face the law," she announced, her voice clear and strong, carrying over the silent crowd. The real law. The one he thought his money could buy. Blackwood and his men were held under guard in the town's small, iron-barred jail, a place they had once considered their private property, to await the arrival of the territorial marshals the town had now sent for. The final confrontation between Marisol and Blackwood was not a gunfight. It was a quiet, powerful exchange through the bars of his cell. He was no longer the arrogant tyrant. He was a defeated man, his empire in ruins, his face a mask of bitter disbelief. "A girl," he whispered, his voice a venomous rasp. All of this, and done by a little, half-breed miner's girl. Marisol looked at him, not with the hatred of a vengeful daughter, but with the cold, dispassionate pity one might feel for a venomous snake in a cage. "You didn't see me, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet. That was your mistake. You saw a girl, a Mexican, a grieving daughter. You never saw the person. You never saw the price of what you had done. The price, he spat. It was just business. My father's life was not a business expense, she replied, her voice as hard as the silver he had coveted. It was a debt. And now, it has been paid. She turned and walked away, leaving him to the silence of his cell and the impending arrival of a justice he could no longer escape. She had not just won a battle. She had fundamentally changed the rules of the game in Silver Creek. The arrival of the U.S. Marshals a week later was an anticlimax. They found the town not in chaos, but in the midst of a quiet, determined rebirth. They found a signed confession from Blackwood coerced by the threat of being left to the mercy of the miners, the damning page from his ledger, and a dozen credible and flinching witnesses ready to testify. The legal system, which had been a tool of the corrupt for so long, was finally forced to serve its true purpose. The North Star mine, its lower levels flooded, and its ownership now in legal limbo, was taken over by the miners themselves. Led by a council that included Elias and Mateo, they began the long, arduous process of forming a workers' cooperative. They were no longer disposable cogs in a machine of greed. They were the masters of their own destiny, their safety and their rights now held firmly in their own calloused hands. But Marisol Vega was not there to see it. Her work was done. Her father's death had not just been avenged, it had been consecrated, its meaning transformed from a senseless tragedy into the catalyst for a town's liberation. She knew, with a wisdom born of her long, painful journey, that she could not stay. She was a symbol of the town's violent, necessary struggle. But Silver Creek no longer needed a warrior. It needed builders, leaders, and peacemakers. Her part in the story was over. The final scene is not a celebration, but a quiet departure. On a cool, clear morning, just as the first rays of the sun begin to touch the high peaks of the mountains, she rides out of the valley. She is alone, a solitary figure on a sturdy horse, with nothing but a small saddlebag and the Colt revolver that has become a part of her. Elias and Mateo are there to see her off, a silent farewell at the edge of town. The town owes you everything, Marisol, Elias says, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely shows. This is your home now. My home was with my father, she replies, her voice soft but firm. She looks back at the town, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the sight of men walking to the mine not with a defeated slump, but with a sense of purpose. You are all my family. And you don't need me anymore. You have found your own voice. She turns her horse, her gaze fixed on the open, unknown territory beyond the valley. Where will you go? Mateo asks, his arms still in a sling but his eyes filled with a hero's worship. Marisol looks at the horizon, a faint, sad smile on her lips. The mountain taught me that there are echoes everywhere, she says. Echoes of men like my father, of towns like this one. Maybe some of them are waiting to be turned into a roar. She rides out, not into the sunset, but into the dawn. She leaves behind a town that has found its voice, a town where the cries of the forgotten have finally become a chorus of justice. Her journey is not over, it is just beginning. She is no longer just a miner's daughter or the ghost called La Sombra. She is a silent promise, a rider for the dawn, on a journey to find other places where the bullet's call for justice has not yet been heard.